So looking at, I went into the Unit 13 quiz and I grabbed all of the translations from the translation pool. I think, especially the undergrad class, you might have only seen 2 or 3 of these, but because they're kind of pulled at random, I figured I might as well pull them all and walk through them. So we'll just start with the first one here. Kind of walking through, what I'll do is kind of a faster pass. I know earlier on we've gone through sort of the method of, okay, so the first thing that I do is I go word for word. I expect the verb or the predicate to be here, parse it out, get all of the grammatical information I can squeeze out of this word, and then move on to the next word, get everything, go all the way through the whole sentence, and then go back and build it in English. And that's really the approach you want to take early on when you're learning how Hebrew structures sentences differently than English. But now that we've had some practice with that, and since we have so many here, I'll go a little bit quicker through, and then just stop me if you have any questions. Let me get my pen here. All right, so this first one, again, we're going to start with the expectation that we've got our predicate or a verb or something like that here at the beginning. The first thing that I notice about this is, I guess, first of all, it has more than 3 letters. So if it is a verb, it's an inflected verb, it's or a conjugated verb of some type. And when I'm looking at this, I notice that the first letter is an aleph. When I have an initial aleph, there are many, many verbs in Hebrew that begin with an aleph in the root, so that's possible. But it's also very common to see an aleph representing the 1CS imperfect form of various verbs. So as soon as I see this aleph at the beginning, I'm starting to think, hey, maybe this is the aleph prefix of the imperfect. And then I notice that I've got a comet hey ending that often pairs with the aleph prefix that makes it not imperfect but cohortative. So when I've got that aleph prefix plus the comet hey, I'm now in the volative or the modal that we refer to as the cohortative. If I take those off, I'm left with samak pei reish as my root. And I think to myself, do I know of a Hebrew root that is samak pei reish? And of course that is the kal would be safar, the PL, which is what we're used to seeing. Well, I guess both of them occur, but the PL would be siper. So now I have to look at, I know that I've got a cohortative, and I know that it is 1CS instead of 1CP, but now I have to figure out the pattern. Is this kal, PL, pual, hifil, hofal, nifal, or hitpile? And at this point, you've only had the PL, the hifil, and the kal, so it's only going to be one of those 3. But as I look at the signs of the pattern, the first sign that I'm going to look to, especially when I have a prefix, is the prefix vowel. And what I see here is that the prefix vowel is reduced. That is your most reliable sign of the PL. Now, this is also a sign for the pual, but there are other things that the pual will exhibit that will distinguish it from the PL. The pual will usually have a kibbutz here. I'm pretty sure that would carry over to the cohortative. And then you're not going to see your theme vowel because it's reduced. But if we're really torn between the PL and the pual, which again, I'm not even sure that I think the pual might have been in that lesson 38 that you guys, more passive verbs. I think you only had to kind of skim through that. You didn't really have to study it in depth, but it is a good idea to skim through that because you are going to see these forms in here. So just know what are the differences between the PL and the pual, the hifil and the hofal. What's the difference between the kal active participle and the kal passive participle? Here, the difference between the PL and the pual is primarily going to be this patach here. If this were a pual, we would see a kibbutz. All right. So confirming that, I do have, again, the patach is another sign of the PL in the imperfect or cohortative. And then, of course, I've got the dagesh in R2. So everything here points to a PL cohortative 1CS of safar. Now, safar, I'm pretty sure in the kal it means to count. And then in the PL it means to, like, report or to tell. We say recount. It doesn't mean count again. Recount in the sense of like recounting a story or something like that. So that can be a little bit confusing. So since it is in the PL, we're going to go with that idea of tell or describe or it's very broad. It can mean declare. It can mean announce. A lot of stuff like that. So we'll just start with tell. All right, and then this is going to be the first person singular, but it's cohortative. So it's not going to be I will tell. That's not what we want. We want cohortative. It's sort of like expressing a desire. So let me tell would be, or may I tell. Again, we're not going for permission there. It's kind of like if, I run into someone at work first thing in the morning, Monday morning, and I say, let me tell you what happened this weekend. It's not asking for permission. It's saying, hey, I want to tell you what happened this weekend. So just keep that distinction in mind. But because it's cohortative, we're going to go with let me, or you could say may I tell you. But that would be a little weird. We wouldn't say may I in English. That would only be for permission. So let me tell. And then here we've got the lamed preposition with the to ms suffix. So this is to you. So let me tell to you. Okay, well, jumping over to English, this doesn't sound good in English. Let me tell to you. So we could either just say, let me tell you. That would be okay. But for first year, I really want to see that you know that this is to. And so that's where tell maybe needs to be changed to something else in English. We might say something like, let me recount to you, or let me declare to you, or let me some verb in English that has a similar meaning as safar, siper, or just tell, but one that will often use that to preposition for the indirect object. Because you here is the indirect object, it's not the direct object. So you could say, let me describe to you, let me announce to you, let me recount to you, something like that. But if you go with let me tell you, that's fine. That's fine. It's just in first year I prefer to kind of see a little bit more word for word, but it's actually a better translation if you just say let me tell you than let me tell to you. So there we've got the first sort of main clause here. Tell what? Well, this is our direct object, but it's not a definite direct object. And that's why we don't have the et particle. So here we have, and this should be a kametz chatuf rather than a patak there. Kol esher, so all which or all that. Amar avinu. So this is a relative clause now. This relative clause is functioning as kind of like a big bubble. And I wish this was all on one line. I would circle it. But this big bubble here is the direct object. Let me tell you. Tell you what? Tell you all of this, okay? So what is this? This is all that or everything that someone said. Who said? Avinu, my father. And I think we actually went through this one in the last video conference, because I pointed out here that av is one of these strange words. It's one of these very, very old monosyllabic words in Hebrew that has the remnant of what used to be a genitive marker. Now, you don't need to know what all that means. All you need to know is that this hirik yod here, this is not part of the possessive suffix. All right, because we kind of learned the difference between possessive suffixes on singular nouns and possessive suffixes on plural nouns. The difference is primarily that the possessive suffix on plural nouns will have a yod. But here on avinu, and if it were the word for brother, achinu, that hirik yod is actually connected to the noun, not part of the subject. If this were our fathers, we would have the aleph, beit, we would have the plural form here, avot, and then we would add to avot the sere yod, not hirik yod, sere yod, nun shurik. Okay, so it would be avotenu, that would be our fathers, but here it's just our father. All right, so let me tell you everything that our father said, lamed hirik yod. So here, let me tell to you, but this is everything our father said to me. And then this achre, this is a preposition that is relating the saying to a particular event. So what is the connection between the father saying things to me and halakti la'ir, my going to the city? What is the relationship between these two events? The father saying something to me and me going to the city. Well, the relationship is that the saying was after achre, and again, this should be a sere, not a segel. Achre halakti la'ir. After halach. Halach here is here we go. This is our root, and this looks a lot like the 3ms Cal perfect form, but we've added this t suffix, and that's the suffix that we add for the 1cs in the Cal perfect. So after I went, lamed kametz. So this is the sign of the definite article. There's no dagesh because ayin is a guttural. It rejects the dagesh, and so the patak of the article will lengthen to a kametz here, to the ir, city or town. Any questions about that one? All right. So next one here. First thing I notice is the vav relative prefix here. You're going to pick up on that pretty quickly when it's in the vav patak dagesh form, because it's a very distinctive form. It's your eye is going to get used to seeing that. So that tells me right away that this is my verb, that this is narrating some sort of action in a sequence. And then to parse this out, I just want to kind of take it apart. So I take off the vav patak dagesh, and I'm left with the yod, shava, dalet. Okay, so yod shava in a vav relative, that yod is going to be my prefix. The shava is going to be the first thing that I look to. The prefix vowel is going to be the first thing that I look to in order to get a feel for what is my pattern here. Is this cal, pl, hifil, what is it? When I have a reduced prefix vowel, that's going to tell me that I'm in the pl. So I can confirm pl by looking at the R1 vowel. That is a patak, which is what I expect in the imperfect family of conjugations. Again, this is technically a vav relative is technically the vav patak dagesh plus the jussive form, but the jussive is built, the jussive is built off of the imperfect family. And then, of course, I've also got my dagesh here to confirm that I have a pl. The shurik on the end is going to be a suffix, so whenever I have a yod prefix plus a shurik suffix, that's going to be the 3mp conjugation. And our root here, davar, in the pl means to speak or to say, So this would be speak. It's going to be they for our subject, and then we'll replace that with the explicit subject if we have one. But what we're going to notice here is the jussive or the imperfect would indicate future time, but the vav relative is going to invert that. So the vav relative on a jussive, or the vayiktol form here, this is going to make this they spoke, past tense. And you might even say and they spoke or then they spoke to kind of account for that vav. But you don't even need to translate the vav because, again, it's not a vav conjunction, technically, in the way that we think of it. It's a vav relative. And so the function here is not so much to... the function is not to be translated as and. The function is to indicate the role of this verb in the narrative flow. All right, so they spoke. Then we would expect, in Hebrew word order, normal Hebrew word order, we would expect to have our subject immediately following our predicate. Ha-neve'im here, this is navi in the masculine plural with the definite article. Ha-neve'im. And so we have here a masculine plural subject that will match our masculine plural verb. And so instead of they spoke, this would be the prophets spoke. I guess it's easier to write in cursive when you're using a mouse. All right, so the prophets spoke. We've got a lamed preposition here with the patak dagesh. So this is to the king. So this is the indirect object. To whom did they speak? They spoke to the king. All right, this is our first clause. In English, you might even say this is our first sentence, depending on how you want to translate the connection or the relationship between these two vav relatives. Because here we get another vav relative. Now this is missing a holum, so that's another thing I need to make a note of. It'd probably be a lot easier to learn Hebrew if the tests didn't have typos in them, but what are you going to do, right? All right, so yeah, when I find these typos in here, I'll usually go back and give full credit for the translations, but it's not good. It's not good practice if you're practicing your translation to not see what you expect to see, because then you doubt yourself. So, all right, so we got vayomeru. Vayomeru here is another vav relative. Like I said, we've got a yod holum prefix. We've got a shurik suffix. So yod holum, this is a combination that we don't see a lot, but it's certainly not PL because it would be reduced if it were PL. It's not hifil because in the hifil vav relative or imperfect, you're going to have a patach here. The reason why we have a holum is because amar is one of the 5 one aleph verbs that in the imperfect family, the aleph of the root will quiesce, and you'll get a holum prefix vowel, basically because this is now an open syllable. So we've got a cow, that happens in the cow. We've got a cow vav relative, 3 MP. The yod prefix plus the shurik suffix indicates 3 MP. And amar is the word for to say, to mention, something like that. And so what we've got here is they said, is probably how I would translate it. They said. I usually tend to default to davar, I'll translate as speak, and amar, I'll translate as say. That tends to, the way that davar gets used in Hebrew lines up a lot more with speak in English, because speak, well, yeah. Amar almost always has a direct object or content following it. Davar doesn't. And so in English, when we use the word speak, that is a, I mean, it can be transitive, but it can also be intransitive. Speak doesn't have to have a direct object. Say, almost always in English, has a direct object. And so those functions line up. Amar almost always has a direct object or content in Hebrew. Say almost always has a direct object or content in English. Speak in Hebrew or in English doesn't need a direct object or content, and davar doesn't need. So it's just a coincidence, but those two tend to line up a lot better than if you were to translate amar as speak and davar as say. You're going to run into some awkwardness there. So they spoke, again, past tense, because we've got the vav relative on the jussive form. That is the vayiktol form. So they said, Barech et Beit Adonai. So we talked again last time when we went through this, we talked about how Barech, technically it could either be an infinitive, they said to bless the house of Yahweh, or it could be an imperative, bless the house of Yahweh. It's almost certainly an imperative in this situation, but with it being an imperative, I would kind of expect key to be here. And I mentioned that before, key kind of marking off, here's the content, bless the house of the Lord. And so since there is no key here, I don't really blame students who translate this as they said to bless, like they told him to bless. they said to bless the house of the Lord. So if you translate this as an infinitive, your sentence would basically be, the prophets spoke to the king, and they said to bless the house of the Lord. That works. So if that's how you translate it, I'm not going to count you off for it. But it seems like this was intended, especially when you look at what the answer given in Canvas is for this, the translation, the correct answer translation, it translates this as an imperative. So the forms would be identical. It's context that kind of determines it for you. And sometimes context could go either way as well. Any questions about that one? Okay. Yeah, those two, the imperative to ms specifically, so not the imperative to fs or any of the plural imperatives, but the imperative to ms specifically will often look identical to the infinitive construct. The only time it won't look identical, usually, is when you've got weak verbs that, especially like third gutturals. Third gutturals will often change because the infinitive will want to maintain the holum, and the guttural will want a patak there, so the infinitive construct will usually have a holum patak, a holum furtive patak situation, whereas the imperative will just go with the patak. All right, looking at this next one here, we start off with vayehi. Now vayehi, again, it is a vav relative on a jussive, but this word is almost a function marker in Hebrew. So when you see this word, a lot of times, I think Fatah even mentions this, you don't even really need to translate it. All you need to do from this word is recognize that this is setting the scene in the past. This is a vav relative on the jussive form of haya. It's not on the perfect form of haya. If it were on the perfect form, you would have the haya, and that would be setting the scene in the future. But here, vayehi, this sets the scene in the past. So we know that we should be probably translating past tense here, whatever happens. All right, so we'll come back to that, and we'll kind of translate it both ways, one including a translation of this, and one that I would probably use, which just leaves it off. So next we've got bayom. So this is the bait preposition with the definite article. We've got the dagesh and the patak in the word for day. So this would be in the day, or maybe on the day, something like that. And then we've got a modifier here for it. So day is masculine singular. We've got the masculine singular demonstrative here. This is the far demonstrative. And it is articular. So that means that what we've got here is an attributive relationship between the two. So this is just going to be that day, in that day, or on that day. And then here, we've got another vav relative phrase. And this is something that Hebrew will often do, is you'll have two vav relative phrases with a temporal marker. Okay, so this temporal marker is saying in that day. In English, we don't build sentences this way. So if we were to literally translate this into literal English word for word, it would be something like, and it happened in that day, and such and such. So it'd be two separate sentences right here. But English doesn't use independent relative clauses. In English, relative clauses are dependent clauses or subordinate clauses. And so we're going to make just one sentence out of it in English. And so we're going to have our relative clause, which is in that day, and then we're just going to put a comma after in that day, and then we'll have our main clause. So in that day, comma, there's an error here as well, but let's just translate through it before I talk about what that is. Here we've got, let's just pretend like this vav relative isn't there. So we've got yamut, and we would ignore that dagesh as well. Yamut. Okay, well this is obviously from the hollow verb mut, which means to die, and the yod prefix without a suffix indicates that it is 3ms. So that would be he will die. Now, when we have a hollow verb in the imperfect, the prefix letter, this is cal, the prefix letter is going to go from hierik, which we normally have for a strong verb in the imperfect cal, or cal imperfect, it's going to go to a kametz. And one of the ways that I just remember that is, it's kind of compensating for the for the lack of a third root letter. You've only really got two root letters with a vowel letter here. So that's just how I associate, that you've got the kametz here. If you want the kind of morphological explanation, the real reason for this is because mut here is one syllable, and it's an accented syllable. And so you've got your first syllable and your second syllable. Well, in Hebrew, if you have an open, unaccented syllable, especially if it's an open pre-tonic syllable, which means the syllable before the accent, if that's open right before the accent, then Hebrew wants this to be what Furtado calls a medium vowel. And so that's why you get a kametz here instead of a hierik, which would be a short vowel. Let me clear some of this up. All right, so the error here, however, is that when you have a hollow verb, like if we cross off the vav relative and the dagesh, there is no error. This looks the way it's supposed to look. But when we go into the vav relative on a hollow verb, that's one of the verbs that shortens. We get a short form. And so this shurik here is either going to become a holum or it might become a kibbutz. I'm not sure exactly which one happens here, but Yeah, I think it probably is. I say it might be kibbutz because we've got the shuruk here, and so sometimes the shuruk will go to kibbutz, but that's the good news about learning to read Hebrew is you don't have to learn how to spell Hebrew. You just have to learn how to read it, right? So that is the error here, is that this vav, the shuruk here, should be either probably a holum. But it does mean, again, without the vav relative, it would mean he will die. With the vav relative here, it means he died. So on that day, he died, or it died. Then we ask the question, what? What's the subject? What died? And here we have ha'am hatameh. So this is basically the unclean people. So this is ha'am, the people, the group. That's why, even though in English the word people can be a plural, in Hebrew the word am is never plural. This is always singular, and it's a collective singular. It refers to a group, but it would be like saying the unclean group died. We wouldn't say... we would say the unclean group is dying. We wouldn't say the unclean group are dying, because group is singular. Well, am is singular in Hebrew, and so that's why we would translate this as the unclean people. Yeah, I guess in English we can't say is dying. You could say the unclean people group is dying, but if you're just going to translate am as people, you probably need to say are dying there. So that's just the difference between Hebrew and English. All right, any questions on that one? All right, moving right along here. Again, we've got Vayehi. That's our sort of scene setter. Oh, I forgot. I was going to say we'll translate it with and without the Vayehi. So with the Vayehi, it would basically be something like, and it happened in that day that the unclean people died. Now, there is no Hebrew word here from which I get that. It's just if I'm going to include this, and it happened in that day, then I have to, just for English rules, include what happened. It happened that something died, okay, or someone died. So with the Vayehi, and it happened in that day that the unclean people died. Without the Vayehi, we would just say, in that day, the unclean people died. And it happened that doesn't really add anything in English. Again, the only reason why it's there in Hebrew is to give you that sort of bold, flashing function marker of what you're about to read is taking place in the past. All right. So again, we start with Vayehi. I don't like the key here, but I could be wrong. The person who put this together knows Hebrew better than I do, but I'm not sure if this is supposed to be there. So again, in English, we say it happened that, but Vayehi is what carries that full meaning. I would translate the whole thing Vayehi as it happened that. So this key here then is superfluous in Hebrew. I think it's here to say that it happened that. But Hebrew doesn't need key for this. So when I see key, that makes me think, well, this has to be the causal key rather than the content key, because Vayehi doesn't need a content key to keep going. So is this, it happened because the prophet went? Probably not. This is probably just extra. It shouldn't be there. And since we're not translating this anyways, we can probably just say, the prophet, Hanavi, the prophet went to the town. And... again, well, yeah, actually, I think Bosh is one of these hollows that this one may retain its holum vav, because in the perfect, Bosh, usually in the Cal perfect, these hollow verbs lose their vowel letter, but Bosh is one of those that retains it even in the Cal perfect, instead of going to like patach or something. So it's possible that even in the vav relative it retains it. I'd have to check on that. But the prophet went to the city, and it was ashamed. But here we have the explicit subject, the people. So again, we've got that awkward thing where am is singular in Hebrew, so it uses a singular verb, but we have to understand that it's a collective singular. It refers to a group of people. So we would say they were ashamed. Who were ashamed? The people were ashamed. We wouldn't say the people was ashamed. We would say the people were ashamed. But again, what we've got here is because we begin with a vav relative, when we have these two vav relatives here, it's always helpful, and this is something that's covered in second year, so, this isn't something you've learned yet. But it's always helpful to think about the relationship between the two clauses that are introduced by vav relatives. How are they related together? This is usually, the vav relative is what we call I want to say conjunctive, but that's only because I'm thinking of the opposite of disjunctive. There are disjunctive clauses. Maybe I want to say coordinating. The vav relative is a coordinating marker. And so you always want to think about, so what is the nature of the coordination between these two clauses? How are they related? How is the prophet went to the city related to the people were ashamed? And this is what calls for interpretation. I mean, the text doesn't tell you, unless there's something in the broader context that would indicate the relationship between these two. But just looking at this out of context, it would seem to me that probably the relationship between these two sentences is that the people were ashamed is the result of, so the action of the people being ashamed is the result of the action of the prophet going to the city. So as a result of the prophet going to the city, the people were ashamed. Or it could be you'll get a whole list of these sort of relationships, syntactical relationships in second year. One that you could suggest here, though you would need some context for sure. The people being ashamed might be the cause or the reason for this clause. Now that's a little bit different than saying, you could also say that this clause is the cause or reason for this clause. The people were ashamed because the prophet went to the city. But if you flip that, you could say that the logically prior situation is that people are ashamed. And so, because people are ashamed, the prophet is going to go to them. And maybe this is like in the context of the people are ashamed of their sin, they're repenting. And so the prophet's going to go to the city to encourage them to, applaud their repentance and encourage them to remain faithful or something. Both of these are completely opposite meanings, completely opposite interpretations. Both are possible with the context that we have here. So to determine between them, you would want to look at clues from elsewhere in the broader context and say which one fits better with what's going on. And just a freebie here, a little pro tip. Generally speaking, when you're making interpretations, the interpretation that introduces the least amount of new conceptual material, the interpretation that changes the context the least, is generally the safer interpretation. So if you've got two interpretations, and one interpretation is bringing in a bunch of meaning that isn't necessarily in the context, and the other interpretation isn't really bringing in meaning that isn't already in the context, the safer one, I can't say the more accurate one, but the safer one is the one that brings less new material in. That doesn't mean that the safer one is always correct. So next one, again, we don't have Vayihi, we have Vehaya. So Vehaya is telling us, again, we're probably not going to translate this, but this is telling us future, okay? So be thinking, whatever you're going to read, we're setting it in the future, so this will happen. So here we have Kishalahu. Kishalahu is a very strange form until you realize that you've got a Kaf conjunction at the beginning and a, let's just call it a pronoun suffix, a 3ms pronoun suffix at the end. This right here is going to be our infinitive construct. And I know it doesn't look like an infinitive construct that we're used to. We're used to in our infinitive constructs a shava under R1 and a holum in R2. But adding this suffix to the end has created a brand new syllable, and it's forced the vowels to kind of reorganize a little bit. So as a result, we're actually going to reduce the holum syllable to a shava. And again, I'm not saying this is the technical linguistic reason why you see this right here. I'm just saying this is, to me, a helpful explanation to remind me why I shouldn't be surprised to see this right here. This is not a kametz. This is a kametz katuf. And the way that I kind of square that, the way that I kind of explain what's going on is, we've got an infinitove. We've got an infinitive that really likes to have that O class vowel. And since we've reduced where the O class would usually show up, the holum, since that holum's gone now, it's sort of repressing the O class, that pops back up over here. Now over here we can't have a holum because I don't really know why, but for whatever, I know why, because this is actually supposed to be a closed syllable. So if this were a holum here, it would be open and you'd have lahu as sort of like, a vocal shava plus hu. But what this is doing is we've actually got kind of three syllables here. We've got k, shol, hu. And so this is a silent shava kind of breaking the word into syllables here. Again, we couldn't have this as a syllable if our vowel was holum, because holum would be open and unaccented. And if it's open and unaccented, then you're going to draw the syllable line right there. So again, that's a lot of kind of technical, morphological, linguistic explanation for the kametz katuf, but I just don't want you to be surprised that you've got an infinitive construct with a kametz katuf in R1, because we're used to seeing shava in R1 and then the holum in R2. Well, because we had to reduce the holum, that O quality just pops back up in R1 as the kametz katuf. All right, so what that means is we've got the verb shalach. Shalach means he sent. In the infinitive, it's to send, and with this suffix here, we have to determine, is this he, as in a subject pronoun, or is this him? As in I don't know why I'm trying to little squiggles here. Is this he or is this him? Is this the subject of send or is this the object of send? Is this when he sent, or I shouldn't say sent, because this has already told us that we're talking about the future. So is this when he sends, or is this when sending him? That's the question, because this suffix, this holum vav suffix, could be either one. It could be the subject of send, or it could be the direct object of send. So is this when he sends, or is this when sending him? We'll have to find out. And we don't have to wait long to find out, because right after that, we get the definite direct object of the infinitive, which tells us that him is not the direct object. So him must be the subject. So this would be when he sends the olah, the burnt offering. All right, so when he sends the burnt offering, where? To ha-mitzbeach. Pull a little doggish in there. Ha-mitzbeach. When he sends the burnt offering to the altar. Now again, this is that situation where Hebrew has a temporal clause that is independent in Hebrew. And it will happen that he will send the burnt offering to the altar. And then Hebrew will begin a brand new sentence. But in English, we can't do that because our temporal clauses in English are dependent. And so we'll talk about how the English will build this. All right, so we start our new clause over here with the vekum. Now, vekum is either a vav conjunction on an infinitive, or it's a vav relative on what is supposed to be a perfect. If this is a perfect, we shouldn't have the shurek, we should have a patach here, the kam. If this is a vav conjunction on an infinitive, I just realized that's a possibility, and I basically have just been giving everyone full credit for this because I thought this was a typo. Let me think about this as a vav conjunction on an infinitive. So that would mean that shalach and kum are coordinate, and I think it would have to mean that they have the same subject. But let's just read through it. It shall happen that when he sends the burnt offering to the altar, he will arise, the priest will arise, the priest. Yeah, I think this has to be, in Hebrew, I think this has to be an independent clause. And if this is an infinitive, it's not an independent clause, which would be my argument for why this can't be an infinitive. And it should be a perfect. Because if it's a perfect, then we get, it shall happen that when he sends the burnt offering to the altar, the priest will arise. Again, that vav relative plus perfect means that we're going to have future time, and that would match the vehaya over here. The priest will arise before the Lord. So unless this is the priest sending the burnt offering to the altar and arising before the Lord, which would seem confusing to me, I do think that my initial, even though like morphologically, this looks like a vav conjunction, not a vav relative, a vav conjunction plus an infinitive. I think in the structure of the sentence, this really has to be a finite verb. It has to be an independent clause even. So that's why I translate this as, if we want to include vehaya, we would say, it shall come to pass. You may have, that may be familiar from the, King James of, the Old Testament or something. Vehaya is probably the Hebrew behind that. It shall be, it shall happen, it shall come to pass that when he sends the burnt offering to the altar, the priest, our subject, will arise, will stand up before Yahweh. Now, unless you know a lot about how sacrifices work, it's a little disjointed. It's like, why does sending the burnt offering to the altar make the priest stand up? Well, he stands up to accept the sacrifice, slaughter, that sort of a thing, I suppose. So, anyways, kind of a very difficult sentence, but anytime this sentence appears, you should have full credit for it. So, hey, here's hoping it shows up on the final, right? We'll see what happens. Okay, but again, I do want to explain, if this were written, with the calm here, and the doggish and the bait, if there were no typos, that's how you should process the sentence. That's how you should think about it. That we've got, again, that situation in Hebrew where it uses the vav relative of haya, either vehaya or vayehi, to introduce a temporal clause, which in Hebrew is independent, but of course in our English translations we have to translate it as a dependent clause, and then this would basically just be the vav relative plus the perfect. All right. Two more. We've got vayomer. Again, vayomer has that holam aleph. That's because amar, again, is one of those 5 Hebrew 1 alephs where the prefix vowel is going to go to holam here. So this is simply amar with the yod prefix and no suffix. So that's going to be 3ms. I'd call it imperfect, but it's got a vav relative on it, and the vav relative goes on the jussive form, which is one of the reasons why I think we get the segel here. But I can't be sure about that without looking into it. So the vav relative, again, we're setting the scene in the past. This is past action. It is 3ms cal, and so this would be he said, basically. All right, so he said, who said? Hamelech, the king said, El, to the prophet. Hanavi, the king said to the prophet. And then this key, after Amar, is certainly going to be content. Okay, so conceivably, someone could have translated Amar as speak, and they could have said, the king spoke to the prophet because dot 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 dot. But that's why I always lean towards say with Amar and speak with davar, because I want you to understand that Amar is almost always going to have this key content coming after it. And I shouldn't scribble it because I want to circle it, but that key is a content key, not a causal key. So we're not going to translate this as because. We're actually going to translate this simply as like quotation marks around what follows. Okay, so we're not really going to translate it at all. All right, so what did the king say to the prophet? Well, this is what he said to the prophet. Bata la'ir ha-resha'a mot tamut. All right, so bata. Bata is from go, or enter, or something like that. Bo, basically. That's my mnemonic. Bo means go, so bo is to go, but it often gets translated as to go in or to enter. So bo in the perfect is going to lose its holam vav, and it's going to take a kametz here. It's going to take a kametz when it has a consonantal suffix. It's going to take a patach. There are times when it takes a patach, and there are times when it takes a kametz, and I can't remember off the top of my head which is which, but as long as you've got an A-class vowel here, you'll be good. So this is perfect. The ta suffix indicates 2ms. You're used to seeing this ta suffix with a dagesh in here, but the reason why that dagesh appears is because tav is a begad kafat letter, and usually it's going to appear after a silent shavah. But aleph quiesces, and so it doesn't take a silent shavah, and because it quiesces, it doesn't even close this syllable. So this is still an open syllable. And when you have a begad kafat letter after an open syllable, it's not going to have its weak dagesh. Okay, and that's why you don't see the dagesh there. So this is basically you went or you entered la'ir, the town, or to the city. You went to the city, ha-resha'ah, the wicked one. So you went to the wicked city. Now the trick here is ha-resha'ah is clearly feminine singular by the kametz. Ir looks masculine singular. But ir is one of those weird ones that even though it looks masculine, it is feminine. And actually the plural form looks masculine, which is ayin, kametz, resh, hirik, yod, mem. Like the plural for ir is arim, and it looks masculine there too. But it's always going to take a feminine adjective, and the adjectives don't lie. The adjectives will give you the true gender of the noun they're modifying. So ir is feminine, so it does match. Both have the article, so it is attributive. You went to the wicked city. Oh my goodness, this key is causal here. That's really confusing. I wish that the... Yeah, I wish that the translations you were given were actual, like, compositional Hebrew instead of, like, us coming up with random things, because something seems wrong about that as well. So this has to be causal because it doesn't make any... This has to be a causal clause, and this is the main clause. So this is the main clause. Yeah, you will surely die. We've got the infinitive absolute, which is intensifying you will die. So again, literally you might say something like dying you will die, or to die you will die, but what that means is you will certainly die, you will surely die. But this here is the reason, this is the cause for you will surely die. Why will you surely die? Because bata la'ir ha-resha'ah, you went to the wicked city. Which is a heck of a reason to die, but either way, that's the translation here. Because you went to the wicked city, you will surely die. So last one here, we've got ana. This is just a cow-perfect 3ms. Ana means he answered. We've got our explicit subject, which is also 3ms, or masculine singular. The man answered. Whom did he answer? Direct object. Et Adonai. The man answered the Lord. And then here you've got, comma, quotation marks. This is how he answered the Lord. This is the content of his answer to the Lord. Nope, it's not. Never mind. We've got a vav relative here, so that's not going to be content. The man answered the Lord, period. And then we've got, and he gave, or he put, or he placed. This is natan in the jussive form, which looks weird, yitain. But this is, and he placed, or and he gave, and he offered, could even work. He offered the burnt offering, the whole burnt offering, at the altar. Now, I think that the correct answer in Canvas says on the altar. I mean, bait can mean on, but when you're talking about a sacrifice upon the altar, I think you're going to use all there. Ayin, patak lamed. I think that's what you're going to use for on the altar. Either way, it's fine. If you say on the altar there, I'm not going to count off for it. But when I see bait, that just makes me think at the altar rather than on the altar. So ba mitzbeach is bait preposition plus the patak dagesh of the definite article, and then of course mitzbeach is missing its dagesh, mitzbeach, the altar. So the man answered the Lord, period, and he put the whole offering on the altar. Now again, you've got two. Well, no, you don't. You don't have two vav relatives, but you do have two. Well, let's not even worry about it. I'm going to say anytime I see a vav relative, I'm always thinking, how does this vav relative connect to the preceding clause? What is the nature of the relationship between the two? But again, that's second-year stuff that you don't need to worry about at this point. All right, so there we go. Those are the translations from the past few quiz, or I guess the last quiz. Yeah. Yeah, you can translate this. Yeah, basically, the word olah refers to a specific type of offering, and that type of offering is often referred to as the whole burnt offering because the whole thing is burnt. It's a whole. It's burnt as a whole is the idea, and so it doesn't. I'm not translating it as he placed all of the offering. In that sense, the whole offering, I'm saying he placed the whole burnt offering. That's what olah refers to, is a whole burnt offering. But if you just say the burnt offering, that's fine. I don't want you to just say the offering, though, because like we've had mincha. Mincha is a word for like a grain offering. Well, this is a different type of offering. And mincha is okay as just plain offering rather than grain offering, because mincha actually kind of gets used as like, it's a word for gift. And it often gets used for the grain offering, but it actually comes from mincha, pardon my terrible mem. Actually, now I'm thinking I don't know what I'm talking about. Mincha. Yeah, the root here is not the root that I was thinking of, so that doesn't work. But the idea here is that mincha is something that's given. And I would say etymologically that idea of a general gift preceded it being used as a word for a grain offering. I think it developed into being used for a grain offering after it had commonly been used as a gift.